Good day, and thank you for joining us on Black Agenda Report. I'm Margaret Kimberly. Please remember to like this video and to subscribe to our channel. The Trump administration has accelerated its attacks on leftist organizations and individuals, while also justifying its genocidal siege of Cuba, with the release of the document Cuba, the Capital of 21st Century Communism. This follows Executive Order National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, NSPM-7, which condemns, quote, anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, race, and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality, unquote. And in so doing, provides a rationale for state repression and the criminalization of left organizing. We're joined by Ajamu Baraka. He's a Black Agenda Report contributing editor, and he's also the director of the North-South Project for People-Centered Human Rights. He provides analysis on this newest iteration of state repression in the U.S. Thanks for joining me, Ajamu.
Thank you for having me, Margaret.
Well, I don't know where to begin. I guess I'll start with the most recent event, this report on Cuba, which also specifically mentions Black Alliance for Peace, mentions National Lawyers Guild, mentions Code Pink, by very specifically mentioning individuals and organization, and making it very clear that the state is prepared to charge people as domestic terrorists, as described in NSPM-7. What are your thoughts this week as these actions are accelerating and moving very quickly?
Well, the issue with Cuba is the entry point for what is basically a broadside assault on what they define as left forces in the United States of America. What they are attempting to do is to operationalize their counterinsurgency strategy, which is really, and they claim that it's counterterrorism, but it's basically a strategy to eliminate all political opposition, to redefine opposition in ways in which there is the possibility of using the weight of the state to not only intimidate, but also to actually prosecute. So they have been using these tools, but we see an acceleration of this process under this administration. And that's important for people to understand, that this is not something that just sort of fell out of the sky from the Trump administration. There's a consolidation process that's been long in development. I argue that process really accelerated under the Obama administration. Of course, there were foundations that were laid under the George W. Bush administration, but with the economic crisis of 2008, we see that there was a real acceleration of a movement toward strengthening the national security state. And we can talk about that in details in a moment. But this foundation that was laid then is the foundation that both the Biden administration used, but primarily now the Trump administration. And it is even more dangerous, Margaret, because of the precariousness of the economic crisis that the U.S. faces. The fact that they perceive that there is a new sort of popularity, if you will, to alternative analysis of what is happening with the economy. That is the newfound interest in socialism, and they see this as a threat. And so this is part of the preemption that the state is engaged in to try to undermine the consolidation of real left forces. They also believe they have to do this because in their efforts to try to extend and maintain their global economic political hegemony, they have opted to use the tools of militarism and war. And to do that, you have to have also domestic compliance. So they are in their efforts engaged in multiple fronts. They are trying to shore up the internal process, the internal potential opposition to their externalized militarism to ensure that they can carry out their agenda without effective internal opposition.
I was just thinking about something. This is, as you point out, it's a consolidation of what's happened in the past. Everyone remembers or thinks about the McCarthy era and the attacks. It's not often mentioned, the specific attacks on Black people, on Black radicals. What can we remember today? What lessons should we keep in mind as we think about that history?
That's a very good question, Margaret, because I was just having a conversation this morning with some elements that should know better, who seem to have forgotten the kind of a particular focus that the national security state will have on Black radicals. Even though the security state will identify and will target a broad range of elements, they have a special kind of focus, and as a consequence, Black radicals have suffered disproportionately as a consequence of this special focus. And as you indicated, for example, at the end of the Second Imperialist War, or the war known as World War II, when the U.S. state believed it had to purge itself of those elements within the U.S. society and the U.S. state that may have had some kind of sympathy toward the Soviet Union. We might recall that during the Second World War, it was, Uncle Joe, because he was, Joe Stalin and the Soviet Union were in alignment with the U.S. and the West against the aggressiveness of the Hitler regime that double-crossed the West by attacking the West. I mean, his role was supposed to be to basically focus in on communism in the East. But of course, that didn't happen, and therefore he became, and fascism became a target. So, fascism in Europe, that is. And so, there was some degree of sympathy for the Soviet Union and the sufferings of the people. Everybody knew that they had suffered tremendously. 27 million people perished in the Soviet Union. So to strengthen the resolve of the U.S. population to engage in what was going to be an assault on attempting to contain the Soviet Union, they began to purge U.S. society of sympathetic elements, targeting the Communist Party, but also targeting very, very specifically those Black radicals that were articulating an agenda of peace, of anti-colonialism, and anti-racism. And so you had organizations and individuals like W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, William Patterson, who were specifically targeted, and the organizations, including the NAACP, the Civil Rights Congress, the National Negro Congress, that were engaged in trying to utilize the United Nations, the newly formed United Nations, to raise these issues of human rights within the country. And so they were massively undermined, repressed. McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee hauled people in front of that committee, intimidated people into silence. Some people had to leave the country, like Claudia Jones, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we fast forward to the 1960s, and we see that with the acceleration of the Black liberation movement, connected to the anti-colonial struggles around the world, the U.S. state again utilizing what we all know of, the so-called counterintelligence program, began to focus in on African or African American, if you will, organizations. It is no, and shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, identified the Black liberation movement as the greatest threat to U.S. internal security. And they operated as a consequence of that determination against us. And so today, as we are facing even more intensive and devastating crisis of capital, because we have to remember that this turn toward the reform of fascism is stimulated by the internal contradictions of the colonial capitalist system. So the economic crisis that we are presently in, and the loss and the undermining of legitimacy, has determined for the ruling elements that they can no longer afford any pretense for liberal values, liberal rights, liberal bourgeois democracy. That it has to be the iron fist unveiled in order to force compliance domestically and to advance U.S. Military strategy externally. And so we have this turn toward neo-fascism in the U.S. And again, we see just in the last few days, last week or so, with those reports you referenced, the report coming from the U.S. State Department, with other reports that are being produced by other rightist elements in the country connected to the Trump administration. And now we see the media now jumping on board, targeting the left, but specifically even more directly targeting organizations like the Black Alliance for Peace and individuals like yourself and me, you know, specifically, targeted and exposed in these various reports as, in essence, enemies of the state. So, we try to help people to remember that as the fascism is consolidated within the U.S., there's going to be this special focus on us, and therefore solidarity, allyship, if you will, is going to be vitally important. We're not trying to suggest we are special, but we do know in the eyes of the state, we become special. So this is the danger that we are now facing in this country, that with the work that we're doing, exposing the contradictions of U.S. imperialism, of not being intimidated and calling what is developing what it is, which is fascism. Because one element of this national security strategy, this domestic security strategy, and the report coming from the State Department is that the very idea of anti-fascism has been criminalized. When they talk about Antifa, everybody knows that's an abbreviation for what? Anti-fascist. There's no such thing as some kind of Antifa autonomous entity. So, here you have consolidating fascism, and people are afraid to use the term. Okay, and in their strategy, they have identified basically three main enemies that they feel they have to focus in on in order to realize what their objectives are. And we'll talk about that in a moment.
What do you say to those? You mentioned the word intimidation, and intimidation is successful if the Secretary of State releases a report that mentions your organization by name or individuals by name. This is something that's at the very least unnerving.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts about how we can fight against feeling intimidated, or feeling like we have to stand down? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, Margaret, we have to continue to do what we have been tasked with doing historically. We have to remember that we're standing on the shoulders of those people like Claudia Jones and W.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, the Civil Rights Congress, the Council on African Affairs. We have the SNCC, the Revolutionary Action Movement, the Black Panther Party, the League of Revolutionary Workers. I mean, we have that responsibility to continue this struggle against these forces that are themselves committed to our demise. And so we continue to do the work. We have to be careful, of course, because they are using the state and legality to try to intimidate and undermine us. But, you know, we remind ourselves and remind others that there's a reason why we have centered this notion of people-centered human rights. We understand that we are, in fact, defending and expanding a conception of human rights that says that everyone has a right to dignity. Everyone has a right to live in peace, to be free of intimidation, to be able to develop themselves and their communities to their logical conclusion. And that in order for us to be able to realize these people-centered human rights, we have to struggle against those forces that deny us our fundamental human rights. And so we continue to do the work and to define what we are in fact involved in as a struggle, as Malcolm and others demonstrated for us, a struggle for, in fact, human rights, but not the human rights articulated by these fake liberals, a human rights that's only focused on the individual, that is usually in line with the perspectives and the interests and analysis of Western imperialism. We say that people-centered human rights is a process in which the people themselves define for themselves the range of their human rights. That they do that because they recognize that they're up against structural forces that are denying them the full exercise, the full realization of their fundamental human rights. And that therefore they have to struggle for their rights. They have to engage in transformative politics. And so, you know, in order to realize fundamental human rights. So it becomes a weapon of liberation. And that's what the state is concerned with. They're concerned with the struggles that we are engaged in, that we are championing, to remind people that they have not only have rights, but they have they represent a majority, and through our collective struggle, we can realize, and that's the only way we can realize our human rights is through struggle. That's why we are lumped in together with these other so-called enemies of the U.S. state. Those three areas that the U.S. state has recognized as the so-called enemies of the state, the terrorists, if you will, they're basically three main types of terror groups, according to the State Department, and that is the so-called narco-terrorists and transnational gangs. We've seen how they use that to engage in state terrorism themselves off the coast of Venezuela and in the Caribbean, to engage in extrajudicial murder, primarily of fishermen, if you will. And the second group, of course, are the so-called legacy Islamic terrorists. But, you know, again, there's qualifications for that also, because I guess they don't include offshoots of ISIS that end up forming themselves into the Nusra Front in Syria, and then are able to, you know, gain political power, and then their president, al-Sarraj, is then invited to be wine and dine at the White House, a Al-Qaeda, ISIS offshoot, if you will. Okay, and then thirdly is what they refer to as the violent left-wing extremists, including anarchists and anti-fascists. Here we have this anti-fascist thing again. Okay, and so these are the groups that they have identified, and through this identification, you know, they are using their intimidation tactics to try to intimidate us into not doing our work, not engaging in opposition to work, not exercising our human rights. We say the way in which you protect and expand human rights is to exercise your human rights. So that is what we intend to do and to continue to advocate for. And we are going to demonstrate that at least for our formation, we cannot be intimidated.
You know, I had another thought as I read this Cuba document, that it is, I'm sure that was not their intention, but it is a reminder of the strength of the Black liberation movement and what we have achieved. Can this possibly be a moment of political education for ourselves and reminding people what we've accomplished and telling younger people what we can accomplish? Can we not turn this to our benefit in some way?
Exactly. That is our task. That's our responsibility. That basically, without any kind of hesitation, we have to, in fact, engage in that. We have to open up new fronts of struggle. Every opportunity we have before us, we have to take advantage of to, in fact, engage in that kind of public political education, if you will, to expand and to strengthen our organizations. You know, every act that we engage in has to be to deepen the ongoing and a crisis of the imperialist capitalist system. Their concern is trying to bring about a new normal, a normal in which, even though people are being ravaged by this backward and barbaric system, there will be social order because there will be no effective opposition. Well, we can't afford that because, again, we will suffer and are suffering disproportionately as the consequence of this ongoing crisis. You see, Margaret, they recognize that these contradictions of the system are irreconcilable, and so therefore they are moving to preempt opposition. So yes, our responsibility is to help people to understand that and not be intimidated, not allow themselves to be resigned that there is quote unquote no alternative. That is what these oppressive forces want us to believe. So no, we're going to continue to struggle, and we know that in this situation that we are faced, and it's a very precarious one. We're not going to, take it lightly. That they're going to use the power of the state to try to not only intimidate us, but actually to use that power to criminalize our opposition. We know that, for example, that beyond the fact that some of us have been identified, our organizations identified, they're moving aggressively against even the People's Forum. Just received a congressional subpoena to turn over their documents by a certain date. We know that some organizations have been contacted by credit card processing firms, saying that basically, if you are using funds that are seen to be directed toward prescribed organizations or states, that you will no longer be able to use their resources, their services. We know that with this report from the State Department that we fully expect, there may be some indictments, there may be seizures of funds, because one element of this internal domestic security process is they want to quote unquote debank and defund the left. That's why they have opened up investigations into Roy Singham, who's in China. That's why Fergie Chambers, the other multimillionaire that's been providing resources to Palestinian liberation groups and other left organizations, is arrested and imprisoned in Spain and attempting to fight an extradition order back to the U.S. They want to undermine the ability of forces to be able to have access to resources to engage in legitimate opposition. So this is what we're up against. This is why it's called fascism. And it's only going to get worse for a while. And that's why people have to understand the terms of struggle. And the terms of struggle require that we cannot have any illusions. We see what happens when you have illusions, when you are the head of certain states, where you think you can engage in a process of diplomacy, where you will be allowed, where your nation will be allowed to operate as a normal nation. When you're up against a vicious enemy that does not recognize your humanity. We're talking about the unprovoked war on Iran. We're talking about the Israeli fascists that are engaged in ongoing genocide in Gaza and murderous assaults on Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. You know, these are the terms of struggle that we have to understand. We are engaged in, and it's a very precarious one. But what other choice do we have, Margaret, besides resistance?
And that is a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Ajamu Baraka of the North-South Project. I ruined the name. North-South Project for People-Centered Human Rights. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.